We all know that the Obama administration is committed to the goal of ridding the world of nuclear weapons. The president outlined his vision in the April 2009 Prague speech, and in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, it listed reducing the role of U.S. nuclear weapons in the U.S. nuclear security strategy and maintaining strategic deterrence and stability at reduced nuclear force levels as two of the administration's 5 aims regarding our nuclear posture. Then in 2011, the president signed his landmark treaty that furthered his goal of resetting relations with Russia and moving the world towards nuclear zero by signing the New START Treaty Instruments of Ratification. The treaty caps the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons at 1,550. But of course, because of the loopholes in it and the counting rules, you can actually have more than that, but we'll move on from there. This is a 74% reduction from the 1991 START Treaty and a 30% reduction under the Moscow Treaty. We have not even begun to see the effects of this treaty. And yet, President Obama wants to go lower. Reports indicate numbers as low as 300 to 1,100 are being considered. And he flippantly said this year, we all know that we have more weapons than we need. So this brings us to the million-dollar question, how many do we need? I would suggest that the general answer is as many as it takes. Our paper submits more specifically that the range is probably somewhere around 2,700 to 3,000 deployed strategic and tactical short-range nuclear weapons. Now, the basis for the differences between those who advocate for further deep reductions and those who believe, like we do, that at the very least we should be where we are, possibly, most likely, we submit that we should have more, lies in the fundamentally different views of 2 major things. The first being, what is deterrence? What is it? Why do we have it? What role do nuclear weapons play in that? And then from that, what sort of credible targeting policy must we have? And then the second point in which we disagree with those who'd like to disarm is, what is the threat? What is the United States trying to deter? Who are our threat? Who is threatening us today, possibly in the future? So I'll kind of explain what our view is of deterrence. Deterrence must be understood in the post-Cold War environment. What does this mean? Often you have those on the left and the Russians accusing those who argue for a robust nuclear arsenal or for not going down to low numbers. They accuse us of still being in the Cold War mindset. I would argue that it's them that are in the Cold War mindset. Why? Well, our nuclear policy and force must be credible to foes, and it must reassure U.S. allies, and, as a corollary of that, it must align with American values. We have to abandon the Cold War policy of mutual vulnerability. That is to say, building a force explicitly threatening undefended population centers and allowing our own population centers to remain vulnerable to nuclear strike. The concept is what we at the Heritage Foundation, in which we reject this, is called the Protect and Defend strategy. The Protect and Defend strategy requires a mix of nuclear, conventional, and defenses that provides the maximum deterrent effect rather than minimal. Even claiming to aim nuclear weapons at undefended population centers is inimical to American values, and as such, it renders such a threat incredible. No one will believe we will do it. Will an American president target a bunch of North Korean peasants? I would submit that he would not, and no one would believe that we would. So what should we target if not population centers? We should target what the foes hold valuable, not what we hold valuable and what we think they should hold valuable, their population centers, their citizens, but what they hold valuable. The assets that enable the enemy, so what are those? The assets that enable the enemy to blackmail or influence the United States by holding the U.S. and our allies at risk of strategic attack. And their means of maintaining oppressive control of their domestic populations. Give an example, the IRGC in Iran. This point deserves underscoring. to convince foes that attacking the United States or U.S. allies with chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons would result in an outcome far worse than the status quo, the U.S. must possess the ability to target the enemy's political and military assets in a strategic attack. This is what is called a counterforce targeting policy, which we strongly defend and argue in our paper. But yes, you know, a lot of the critics will say, but Rebecca, we have conventional weapons. Isn't it more credible for the United States to threaten our enemies with conventional weapons rather than nuclear weapons? My answer to that would be sometimes, maybe. But I would certainly suggest that in many cases it would not. Conventional forces certainly can't reach some hardened and deeply buried targets. And in those hardened and deeply buried targets are what I would presume, what I think many of us would presume, are what the enemy actually values most, what they spent the most time burying and hiding and making so they're actually impenetrable against conventional forces. But I would even suggest, I would go further and suggest that even if a conventional weapon could technically reach a target, that it may not be the optimal weapon the United States might want to use in a particular situation. Why? Because nuclear weapons have a real psychological effect, and that can't be discounted. We're talking about deterring war, not fighting war. We're talking about deterring conflict, preventing it. General Chilton once said about this particular point, we have to be careful when we start talking about one-for-one substitutions for conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. For nuclear weapons, because the nuclear weapon has a deterrent factor that far exceeds a conventional weapon. Another point on reassurance. You often hear folks who are arguing for lower numbers suggest that when you bring up the argument, what about our allies? What do the allies think about the United States replacing nuclear weapons with conventional weapons? And you have those disarmers say, well, conventional weapons can also replace the nuclear umbrella for our allies. But that is not what our allies think. And in reassuring our allies, it is not what we wish that our allies thought. It is, in fact, what our allies deem necessary for reassurance. So what do our allies say about this? Japanese Defense Minister Kiyoma said what he would like out of the U.S. to reassure Japan is, quote, highly accurate nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. And then he stated, quote, the strongest deterrence would be when the United States explicitly says, if you drop one nuclear bomb on Japan, the United States will retaliate by dropping 10 on you, end quote. This is important. Reassurance of our allies, in fact, depends on what they perceive as reassuring. And if we dictate to them what should be reassuring, they might go ahead and decide to acquire their own nuclear weapons. So by going down to lower weapons, you can actually have the unintended consequence of actually spurring on proliferation. Last, I'll touch on the differences in the views on the threat. In the Global Zero report, which some of you may have seen, General Cartwright's name was on that report. And it claimed that there is a small to no chance the United States will ever war with Russia or China. The specific statement in the report, and this is important because this goes into their assumptions as to why they came up with such low numbers. The report said, the risk of nuclear confrontation between the United States and either Russia or China belongs to the past, not the future. This is an audacious hope, and it's not connected to reality. In fact, in 2007, since 2007, the Russians have threatened either explicitly or implicitly to use nuclear weapons on the United States or our allies multiple times, senior leaders. Dr. Mark Schneider has he's got a great compilation of quotes from the Russians on this that deserves your attention. It's amazing because many times it doesn't even make it into the press. But the Russians actually, nuclear weapons are what the Russians view as the most important thing in which they use to influence, especially regarding the United States and our allies in the region. So I'll close with this. The advocates of going to low numbers, those who advocate for eliminating a leg of the triad, which we've seen that as well, are in fact devaluing U.S. nuclear weapons. And this is because the sole purpose of the Obama administration's minimal deterrent strategy is to provide a stepping stone for complete U.S. disarmament. We oppose this. The world is not safer when America is weaker. American nuclear weapons deter aggression and protect America and our allies. Nuclear weapons themselves are not a threat to peace, I would submit. Rather, the actors who would seek to harm peaceful nations by using nuclear weapons are those who are a threat to peace. We must have a flexible nuclear force, a resilient that gives the president options in the event of nuclear confrontation, and such a force preserves peace. Failing to maintain such a force due to an ideological opposition to nuclear weapons and then setting a low number and then working back and developing a policy from there is dangerous, and it can have the unintended consequence of actually inviting aggression and increasing the risk of nuclear war. Thank you.
Rebeccah, thank you. That was splendid. I would just add that this is an extraordinarily important topic, and I commend you and Baker and the Heritage Foundation for taking this on as you have. I have said this before, I think, but I just can't say it often enough. This is perhaps the single most extraordinary thing that is being done to our national security with essentially no debate at all. And what Rebeccah is talking about is, of course, a process that is somewhat prospective. But the thing that I'm talking about that sort of underpins this and makes it worse in a way is the malign neglect of our military's nuclear forces that has been going on now, certainly for the past 4 years, and arguably maybe in a more benign way, but still neglectful way, for most of the 20 years prior to that. As people in this room know, we haven't tested any of these weapons in 20 years in a realistic underground fashion. And that's just one example of a failure to modernize or even, I think, maintain the industrial or military competencies required to make this deterrent work. So really, quite apart from what is being done to set the level at some standard below what it is now, the hollowing out of these nuclear forces is an extraordinarily risky business, to the point where you could be, not so far down the road, I think, with a force that is totally incredible, whatever the number may be, which just reinforces your point. Could I just say one other thing before opening it up? We are prospectively going to have nominated very shortly as the next Secretary of Defense, not a General Cartwright, but a man who completely agrees with his analysis, Chuck Hagel. A former United States Senator, you have to assume that he will be treated favorably, generously, even by his former colleagues. I personally believe everything must be done possible to fight this nomination, not least because of this attitude towards denuclearization, but also towards Israel, as we were talking about before, towards Iran, with which he is deeply implicated in ways that I think will be shocking when they come out. And, of course, his attitude towards cutting the hell out of the defense budget. So for all these reasons, I encourage everyone here not only to take very much to heart what Baker and Rebeccah have written here, but also to saddle up for the fight on the Hagel nomination if, in fact, it's made. So questions or comments? George.
Hi, George Nicholson. Excellent briefing. Question, there have been some comments in the last couple of years about the validity of the triad. Is it still valid? And particularly when we talk about the triad, the air breathing part, what do you see as the continued need for the emphasis of a new long-range stealthy strike bomber?
Yeah, we need it. I will say this, the Cartwright report did argue that we no longer need a triad, but it specifically said that we could do without the ICBM leg, and that we could just do with just the bombers and the sea-based missiles. I just want to say one point on that. If we did that, if we went down to a dyad, got rid of the triad, in doing so, we would move the U.S., we would move the targets that our opponents would be targeting the United States. We would be moving the targets from 455 to about 5 in the event if we were on the receiving end of a nuclear strike. That's how dangerous it is going from a triad to a dyad. Baker, if you have anything to add on that.
Obviously, throughout the Cold War, there were considerations with regard to the advantageous nature of the triad for both reasons of survivability and for reasons of executability. Specifically within this area, what would it be that would be the best combination for holding the necessary target list at risk for the presumed enemies of the United States? I strongly believe that those arguments about the synergy of the triad are persistent advantages regardless of the Cold War versus the post-Cold War environment. Air-breathing element of the triad gives you flexibility and signaling capabilities that the other two do not. Sea-based systems, at least for the time being, as long as they're at sea, are more survivable. And the land-based portion of the triad has strong command and control advantages and also presents targeting difficulties for any presumed adversary that are pretty compelling, as Rebeccah already suggested. So I think that the triad has strong objective reasons behind it. The only thing that serves to undermine it, of course, as a practical matter, is that when you talk about these numbers, can you sustain a triad at fewer than 1,000 deployed warheads? As a theoretical matter, yes. As a practical matter, it becomes very, very difficult.
I will say this, the Senate just passed a provision by voice vote in which they emphasize the need to maintain a triad. So that's good and encouraging, and it kind of took me by surprise a little bit.
But Rebeccah, just to go back to the essence of the question, it's all well and good to talk about the utility of a triad, but we're at a point now where we are going to have to modernize
Exactly.
its various component parts. A new submarine has been on the books for some time. New ICBMs are talked about from time to time, mostly vacuously. But a bomber has been, I think, actually in the FIDIP as a very early stage development project, if I'm not mistaken. But I have the feeling that's going to be over the side here if it isn't already in the new budget regimen. But do you want to talk about how urgent it is, Baker, Rebeccah,
Yeah.
it is to actually undertake this kind of modernization?
Well, I'll just say it's the alligator closest to the boat. Modernization. We can talk about numbers, but we've got to modernize the forces we have. I was at a conference, private conference, a couple weeks ago. One of our a British representative, he's retired, said, he said, do you realize that the Brits still are making nuclear weapons? The United States is the only nuclear power that isn't modernizing our nuclear weapons. So, you know, we might think that the rest of the world, that nuclear weapons, we might make the argument that they're obsolete in this day and age, and so they don't deserve our attention and time and resources. The rest of the world disagrees.
And I just say that with regard to the report, obviously because of the nature of the way these things are discussed today, is the immediate focus is on the numbers. But I would say that in the paper that you have before you, well over 50% of it talks about the future of the nuclear force in qualitative terms, most specifically because we recognize that targeting policy, while not the exclusive driver of what the design of the overall nuclear force should be, both qualitatively and quantitatively, is that the reverse is the case as well. That is that if you go to lower numbers with lower levels of quality within that force, including alert levels, command and control arrangements and other things, you have backed yourself into a counter-value targeting policy, right, whether you want to admit it or not. And quite frankly, the supporters of minimal deterrence are, shall we put it, squeamish about acknowledging that, in fact, they want to go back into that because they recognize the moral problems with doing so.
Well, but it's on the road to zero, which will eliminate that immoral problem. Fred?
I just, based on the report that you just gave, it would seem the successful launch by the North Koreans of an ICBM is an inconvenient truth, juxtaposed against the denuclearization program for the administration. Will that event in any way mitigate this strategy to take down either a smaller triad or a dyad? Because it seems at this point, even Jay Carney was reluctant to even criticize that launch. Is this a preview of coming distractions?
I can tell you what I hope it's going to do. I hope that this launch, and in fact, I mean, I was just talking before we started the discussion here, the North Korean launch, and even the Israelis showcasing what missile defense can do in real time. That just occurred, and then on the back of that, you have the North Koreans successfully launching a satellite into space, which that technology can be directly used to a long-range missile that could reach the United States. So what kind of effect is this going to have on this discussion and on the missile defense discussion, which I think, you know, belong in the same discussion? Will it have an effect? I don't think so. I hope that it will. It should. But as you indicated, you barely heard a peep out of the administration when that happened. You had one press release that came out from the National Security Council spokesman in which he said that the North Koreans should learn from this, that they're only going to be further isolated and will not have the ability to do what, you know, their national goals or something like that, which I would argue that they've actually learned the opposite is true. And it's only empowering them, and it's only demonstrating how weak this administration is. But to your point too, I mean, if I were still doing, you know, working in the Congress and stuff, I mean, I tell you, I would be working to pull all of this information out and make a really compelling case that, look, now is not the time. You've got other countries that are nuking up. Why would the United States be lowering our nuclear weapons and neglecting to modernize them? Why would we be failing to actually implement a comprehensive, robust missile defense system when we have both administrations, this one and the previous administration, both acknowledged, not explicitly but implicitly by the missile defense architecture that the Obama administration is advocating for, in which there is a fourth phase meant to what? Meant to strengthen homeland defense. Well, why would they do that? Because they must believe that it needs to be strengthened. And so I would be arguing now that now is the time. We can't wait all day. We can learn from the Israelis that these things take time, and if we want to be ready when the time comes, then we need to be working on them now. So we'll see what kind of effect it'll have. I know there are some in the Congress that have picked up on this and are working really hard to make sure that they can take advantage of the opportunity. I mean, you'd think that there'd be no better opportunity than a launch from a rogue state to fix our strategic arsenal.
Wade, we're going to, Baker, let's just quick. We're almost really just about out of time, but.
Inherent in the modernization of our nuclear deterrent, don't you have to worry about the pits too? Because the pits are the aging, the fissionable material in each warhead, and unless you keep up and make sure that those are fresh, that you may have a warhead with aging pits, and you have to make sure that those are up to date as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so. Baker, do you have anything else? I just agree with that.
It seemed obvious to me that that would be the case, but don't presume it. You will find that there are technical experts, including out of the national labs, that would say that the stockpile stewardship program, absent testing, absent full-scale modernization of the core of the nuclear weapons, the pits as you refer them to, can be confirmed with high reliability, and that
Indefinitely.
essentially indefinitely, without any necessary concern about what the effects of aging would be at all. So, if the policy community concedes it to the technical community about what the risks are with aging with regard to the core elements of a nuclear weapon, I think you're going to end up with the wrong answer.
Yeah, this really, I think, comes down to national security malpractice, to be honest with you, compounded by what I would call national security fraud, which was the statement the President made a week or so ago to the effect that the world is now moving towards a world without nuclear weapons. This is, you know, an outright falsehood. akin to claiming that Al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat and that we're pivoting to Asia in a militarily significant way, and that the Joint Chiefs of Staff don't want more money. I mean, this is a pattern, folks, that is developing here, and I think it just happens to be particularly egregious in the case of the nuclear forces because, as we've been discussing, the end state, even reached unilaterally for this president, is the denuclearization of the United States. And it is well advanced, I'm sorry to say.